Hello and welcome back. In this video I'm going to be doing perpendicular glass fusing. So what we usually do when we do kiln glass is we fuse two pieces of glass together side by side, or we fuse two pieces of glass together on top of each other, or a combination of the above. But we don't fuse glass together like this. So this is what I'm going to be doing with no gluing and no slumping. This is how it's going to come out of the kiln. And the project I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making a holder for cell phones. And the mold making materials I'm going to be using is a piece of scrap stainless steel sheet metal and a kiln brick. I use kiln bricks a lot in mold making because they're easy to cut and sand, and they take shelf primer nicely, and they're about $5 each from pottery supply places. So I'll just draw it out on a piece of paper. If this is a cell phone with like an edge view, then I'm going to be doing this. If this is like a tabletop, then my holder, I'll put a little tab on the front here, and a base, and a big tab that goes up the back to support it. Draw it again on another piece of paper and flip it around, and now I can work on the mold parts to make this happen. So I'll start by drawing in my kiln shelf down here. So I need a mold part that has a little notch in it here so I can insert a piece of glass here for the tab on the front of the holder. And I need a triangular piece in here to support this piece of glass, and I need another triangular portion over here. And this piece has to extend a fair bit along because I need to be able to support the flat area of the bottom of the holder. So I'll just thicken up the glass portion here a little bit. So that when I draw my little notch in here, it's easier to see with the thick felt pen line. Okay, so this brick piece here will have a little notch cut in it, and I'll use kiln brick for this piece here. But I can't use kiln brick for this center piece because the kiln brick has very low expansion, and because I've got glass surrounding it here, the glass will be contracting when it cools, and it will pinch against this mold material and crack, unless this mold material has a higher expansion rate than the glass. And that's why I'm going to be using the sheet metal stainless steel for this piece here only, because it'll contract more than the glass and prevent that from happening. So there's only really a couple of measurements I need to decide on here. I need to decide what the angle is going to be here that supports the cell phone, and I need to decide how wide this saddle is going to be at the bottom. I know that some cell phone cases are wider than others, like those Otter ones are quite wide. And I know that some people have those collapsible buttons on the back of their phones that you can insert between your fingers, and that takes up a little bit of space as well. So let's get that angle established first. So I'll be measuring and cutting the brick in behind here, but I'm not going to go right to the edge because it's a bit chippy. I just put this here to lean the phone up against to make a decision on the angle. I think that's too steep. I might just go a little more. I'm trying to find a pleasing angle that supports it. Oops, slipping a bit there. Yeah, I think that'll work. So I'm going to mark that with the pencil. And I'll be cutting that one there. And from the other end of the brick, I'm going to be taking advantage of the nice square factory cut edge. And I'm going to be cutting this piece here. And I'll make this the factory edge, so it's a nice tight fit up against my folded stainless piece. And I'll be making this one about 1.5 inches wide for stability. And finally I have to decide how long this piece is going to be here. I think I'll make the stand about twice as wide as this distance for stability, because some cell phones are actually taller than mine, so that'll give it a bit more support. because the actual length of this tab here is going to be 2.5 inches, which is the entire height of my kiln brick. So I'll double that for stability. So it looks like I'll be coming out twice this distance. And I've got almost an inch here, so let's just give it 2 more inches. And I'll mark it there for cutting. Alright, let's get this outside for cutting. As I've said in other videos, I always do the cutting and sanding and drilling and whatnot of kiln bricks outdoors because of the dust hazard. And I'm going to be using another piece of kiln brick with the clean square factory edge as a guide for the saw. So I'll be putting it right up against my line and holding the saw tightly up against the edge of this brick. And for saws, I just use crappy yard sale hand saws. I don't really use anything special because the material in the brick eventually wears down the teeth of the saw, so it makes them useless for cutting wood. Alright, I've got my pieces cut, but this is a sharp edge here, so I'm just going to sand it down a little bit with sandpaper. And this is what I'm talking about here, this sharp corner. There's real potential for all this glass to pinch and break off little bits of my mold material when I release it from the finished project. Okay, now I have to cut this notch and my brickwork is done. So I'll go back to my model here, my cell phone, and I'll just hold a piece of glass up to it here and try and decide what would be a good edge to have here on the side of that saddle. And I think that's about good there, and I'll mark it with a felt pen. And I'll transfer that 3/8 of an inch over to the brick. So I'm working down the factory sawn side of the brick now, and I'll measure that 3/8. Okay, there, so that's the depth of my notch. Now I have to measure the width, which is going to be 1 piece of 3mm glass. And now I'll take this one outside and saw that little notch out of there. I'm going to use a much smaller saw this time with much finer teeth. And then I'll get into that corner and make a nice clean edge with the file. Alright, I'm done with the brickwork now, but I saved this little piece here that came off this angle, and that'll help me with the metal work. So now I have to fold this mold piece up out of sheet metal, and it's going to wind up looking like this. But before I transfer these measurements to the sheet metal, I have to decide on the width of my saddle here that the phone's going to sit in. So I've got this phone here, which is a fairly slim phone. I think I'm going to make it much larger than my drawing, probably another 1/8 of an inch larger than my drawing. There, so yeah, 5/8 of an inch, just for those really puffy phone cases. So from my brick cutoff here, one side of the sheet metal before the fold will be the 2.5 inches, and then I'll be adding 5/8 on the saddle. And this line here is grown now because it's on an angle, so it's actually more like 2 7/8. So for laying out the sheet metal for cutting, I'm not going to make it the same width as the whole brick, which is 4.5 inches, because cell phones simply aren't that wide. I'm going to make it, how about 3.5 inches? I mean, this isn't a large phone, but they can be a little bit wider. So we need 2.5 inches first for the straight side of the kiln brick, but I'm going to move the ruler down a little bit and make it a little bit longer, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then we need 5/8 for our saddle groove, and then we need 2 3/4, 2 7/8 for the long angle, but I'm going to add a little bit there as well. Okay, so I'll cut this piece out roughly from the sheet metal. And I've got a factory edge here on my sheet metal, so I'll take full advantage of that. and do my 3.5 lengthways. So I'll be making all my cuts a little bit bigger than my pen lines here. And the main reason for that is this. Here's a line that someone cut on this piece of scrap metal, and you can see those dents all the way along. And those are areas where the metal has expanded because the shearing action actually has to spread the metal in two different directions so that the shearing blades can get through. And every time that shearing blade has been repositioned, you can see how it expands the metal. So that's what I'm going to be avoiding here by doing these extra cuts. And my preference is the offset cutters, which look different than the straight cutters. And there's my long cut line, and you can see those little bumps. So that's the result of the metal being forced in both directions at the same time. But what I'm going to be doing now is, by cutting a small curl off the end, it's indeed going to curl because it'll be absorbing all of the tension, and then it'll leave a much cleaner cut. So that's why I'm doing a double cut here. This is the finished cut that I want. And because the metal is so thin here, it'll bend easily and take all the shearing pressure. Alright, let's have a look so far. Look at that curl. You can see now what I'm talking about. That little piece is absorbing all the shear pressure, and I'm getting a beautifully straight line. There. And if this was half the width, the curl would be even tighter. There, and there's the difference. The lower one is a single cut edge, and the upper one there is the cut I just did. You might want to say, gee, this doesn't have anything to do with glass fusing, but being able to make your own high-quality stainless steel molds has a lot to do with glass fusing. So I've got two folds to make. I'm going to make this one first, which is the 2.5-inch one, and it's a right angle. And then I'll flip it around and do the second fold, which is a different angle. So for the bending, if I had a wooden table, I would put a square underneath it first to get a nice metal edge, but I happen to have a metal table. I used a wooden table on the video when I made the stainless steel vitrograph boxes, but this time I happen to have a metal table, so I'll use that. And I'm going to clamp this square down onto it like this first. Then I've clamped this T-square down nice and tight, and I'm going to use a piece of wood because I have to apply a lot of pressure. Then I'm going to finish it off with a hammer. So there's my right angle bend. Now I have to get my brick scrap to use as a reference to do the other angle. There, that's what I need to replicate. Let's just test it out here. Not quite the right angle. It looks like it has to go a little bit more. Alright, my angle's perfect. Alright, I'll get my mold pieces back here, and I'll drop in my folded angles. There. Now I need to measure and cut the excess here on both sides. Wow, look at that. That line I just drew is right on top of the line I drew when I was laying this up on the sheet metal. Okay, I'll get these cut. Okay, there's my mold. I have to peel the coating off the stainless and then throw it in a kiln and bring it up to at least 12 or 1300 to tarnish it so that it can accept shelf primer. For me, that's the hardest part of stainless steel molds, is getting the shelf primer to stick to it. So I'm not going to hit it with a torch. I want even heating. That's why I'm putting it in a kiln. So while this is heating up, I'll go and put shelf primer on the brick pieces. So the only part of these that need coating with shelf primer is the tops, a little groove in here, and that angled side there. And just my luck, I've got a nice big air bubble there, but that's actually good because then I can show what I do with that. I scrape up some of the thick goop that stuck to the edge of my shelf primer pail, and I use that in the bigger holes. It has to have a very low liquid content or it contracts when it dries. And a couple more decent layers and they're ready. And the kiln's still at around 500 from the tarnishing of the stainless, so I'll throw these in for drying. And I'll take out the stainless while I'm at it. And while this is still hot, I'll start to coat it. And I've got a heat gun here. I'll just hit it with a bit of heat and dry it off without heating it up too much. I don't want to flake it off. A hairdryer would work as well. And the first layer has to be completely dried before applying the second layer. And the second layer has to go on very quickly. If I slow down at all during my brush stroke, then the second layer will dissolve the first layer. So it has to be very quick. Like that. And where the wet meets the dry, I can't overlap the wet with the fresh layer because it will wipe it off. So I have to dry that first before I can apply the second layer to the saddle area here. And now I can apply the second layer to the saddle. There. Of course I could have just wrapped a piece of kiln paper around that entire thing, but I do prefer not to use it. Alright, that didn't take that long at all. Now my custom mold is ready for glass. So, I'm going to be putting a piece of glass in here in my little 3mm slot. But I want it to extend slightly above the kiln brick level to make sure that it makes a good adhesion to the piece of glass I'm going to be placing on top. And the same with this piece here. I'm going to put a piece of 3mm glass in here, and I want that to extend just a little bit above the area where the top piece will be sitting. And then I'll be putting the top piece on. So it's going to look like this before firing. So I've got my mold parts here, and I'm going to start with the small area here. Put a piece of glass in and mark it. And I'm going to add a little bit of that to make it a little bit higher than the top of the kiln brick there. And next I have to do the same thing with this piece. So put the glass in there. Be careful not to scratch the shelf primer. I'll put the glass in there and I'll mark this one and cut slightly above my mark. So I'm giving this one a little bit extra because it's on an angle, so the cut edge isn't meeting the top piece evenly. There's a bit of empty space there that I have to compensate for. And the final piece I have to cut is the top piece, which is actually the base of the phone stand. So I think 4.5 inches. That's what I'll do. There, my glass pieces are ready, but because I'm pretty much doing a full fuse on a single layer of 3mm glass, I have to sand all the edges on my bottom piece here, and I have to sand the sides and the tops of these two pieces here. Not the areas that are being fused together, but the exposed areas up here and down the sides. So on a piece of belt sander belt that I've wet, I'm going to do all four sides and the corners of my base, but on the two tabs that are sticking up I only have to do the sides and the exposed top corners. I don't have to do the flat part at the bottom because it'll be fused into the base. So for kiln boards, I'm using these 6-inch bisque-fired ceramic tiles that I've coated with shelf primer, and I'm using two of them, one for the bottom and one for on top. Alright, let's finally put some glass on the mold. So I'm going to start with the little one first here, and I'm going to put it with my rounded sides facing down, which would be the outside, like that. And then I'm going to put my large tab in with the rounded corners facing down as well. And press that up against there. Now I have to make sure that these are lined up. Now before I put the top piece on, I'm going to bind this together with a piece of stainless wire, just to keep it from spreading in the kiln. I'm just going to try and do this as gently as possible so I don't have to realign my pieces. It doesn't have to be super tight or anything, it just has to be a way of containing this so it doesn't have the opportunity to spread. Okay, let's have a look at my alignment here. Yeah, I think it's okay. Now it's time for the top piece. So I'm going to leave this little bit exposed on the front like I mentioned when I was doing my drawings. Just line it up nice, and I'm going to square it up along the edge of the kiln brick here. Okay, I think that's perfect. There, and you can see how both my pieces of vertical glass are extended above the surface of the mold to ensure really good contact when this glass comes down and starts sticking. And because I'm doing a single layer of glass and I have to bring it up to pretty much a full fuse, I have to do a press firing. So that means I have to apply another kiln board to the top surface to prevent the heat from damaging my corners and edges and pulling in with the surface tension. So I need to find something that can handle that temperature range that's the same thickness as my glass in order to elevate this top kiln board so it doesn't actually do any pressing and spreading out my glass. And I found something. Nuts and washers are usually my go-to for this kind of thing when I need to elevate a kiln board a little bit. So I'll just put these on the corners to support the top kiln board. And it's finally ready for the kiln. Okay, now for the top board with the shelf primer side facing down. So it's going to sit on the glass, but as the glass melts and moves downward, then the kiln board will go down and it will stop when it hits my spacers. So for a firing schedule, I'm going to run this up around 350 an hour to 1500. And I'm going blind here. I can't actually check it to see how it's doing because of that cover piece on the top. So the only visual I can get here is there's a little bit of glass sticking out this edge here that I can see. But my main indicator is going to be when I can see that this kiln board has gone down to my spacers. Then I'll know the firing's complete. Okay, I'm at 1500. Let's have a look. Yeah, it looks like that kiln board's gone right down to my spacers. So I'm actually just going to turn it off and let it cool down slowly overnight. I'm not going to hold it at 1500. The thing is, it went up so slowly, it had a lot of time to acclimatize to a gradual temperature. So running it up quickly, I would have had to hold it. But running it up very slowly, I don't feel like I need to hold it at all. Okay, We'll have a look at this tomorrow. I'll have to take this binding off first here to get the molds apart. Alright, so I'll pull out this mold section here and then I can lift it out. Wow, that's amazing. That's an interesting shape to get out of a fusing kiln. Let's wipe off the shelf primer and see how it works as a phone holder. Alright, let's have a look at this thing. Turned out pretty good. I've got a little bit of texture on my glass surfaces from the shelf primer texture and the brick molds. Turned out really nice. Look at that. Beautiful, beautiful angle. Wow. And there's enough support back here so that it won't be tippy when there's a phone in it. Yeah, it turned out great. And let's have an edge view look here. Nice stuff. You can see that my brick corner is much tighter than my bent stainless steel corner, but it's nice on this side. The stainless steel mold bend left a nice curve back there at the back of the saddle. And all my edges are nicely rounded, and I was able to maintain my 3mm thickness because of the spacers I used on the top there. Turned out great. And let's put a phone in there and see what that looks like. Yeah, it's perfect. Look at that, nice angle. And there's a bit more room in the saddle here for thicker phone cases. And there's enough of a tab back here so that if you were to push on the phone, it's not going to tip over. And let's have a look at the mold. This edge that I sanded that I was concerned about is fine. None of it chipped off and wound up in my tight angle of the glass. And overall the mold's in really good shape. There's no flaking on this either, which is nice. So before I use the mold the second time, I'm just going to go along and I'm just going to make a little bit of a powder layer on the shelf primer, just to freshen it up a little bit. So for my next one, I'm going to use this glass here, and it doesn't have to be compatible because I'm only fusing it to itself. I'm not mixing it with any other glass. And I want to use this area here on the vertical backside because it's the prettiest part of the strip and it's the most visible when the phone's not on it. And like last time, I'll put my pieces in here and mark them, and then I'll add a little bit extra so they fuse nicely. And I'm going to use this glass for the following one. So I'll be cutting the base here with this orientation, and then the back of the saddle and the front of the saddle I'm going to cut out of the same section of glass so they have the same orientation, but they also have a continuation of the same design. Alright, I have my next two ready to go. So the edges are sanded all the way around on the base, but only on 3 sides for the back and front of my saddle. So like before, the unsanded section facing upwards in the mold, and I have to remember I want this to be visible in the mold, so I have to face it downwards towards the viewer if the stand was sitting empty. Okay, I just have to line these up, and then I can bind it with the wire and put the spacers on and the top. Okay, and this one's ready for the kiln. Alright, let's get this one out. A bit of shelf primer dust on this one. Yeah, because I was rubbing the shelf primer instead of refreshing it. It's nice and dusty. But that opal glass didn't stick to it, which is the benefit of that. Wow, that's beautiful. I love that wood grain look. Okay, on to the next one. After this one, I am going to have to freshen up the shelf primer. I do like to minimize how much of it I use because it does build up over time, especially on these individual molds that see a lot of repeated use. Alright, let's get this third one out. I'm only doing these 3 examples, but there's so much potential here for this technique, especially if the glass has pre-fired designs on it. Beautiful, just like the others. Nice rounded corners, nothing sharp, everything fused together nicely. Got a little bit of shelf primer dust to wash off, and that's it. There, and I remembered to line up my glass so that the orientation of my design is continuous from the front tab here right through to the back. And look at that edge, beautifully rounded and fire polished. Nice stuff. So there's something else I'm going to do here. Because this one has an opaque bottom and you can't see through it to the table below, I'm going to put this self-adhesive neoprene rubber on it so that it doesn't slip and slide around. This is a material that I used in a different video. It was video number W-102 when I was doing the kiln casting using a sand bed. So I'm going to cut this out now and stick it on the bottom. And I'm going to make it about 1/4 inch smaller than the glass so that it's not visible from the edge. This stuff is really handy. I've used it for all kinds of things like tool handles and stuff like that. And it's a great non-slip surface. There, perfect. And here it is, glass on glass. And you don't hear that annoying scratching, grinding sound. And it stays put. Just perfect. I wish I could put that stuff on the other ones, but you'd see it through the bottom. Actually, I'm going to do it anyways. I'm going to put it on the bottom of this one, but not the clear one. There, it's actually not that noticeable under there because of the design. Hey, these could be used sideways when phones are being charged. That's perfect. So, you may ask, why not make the whole thing out of stainless steel and not use the kiln brick at all? And there's a couple of good reasons. The first one is, this little tiny bend here would be very difficult to do with a stainless steel bend on a metal brake to get that 3mm kick in it. It'd be very difficult to do without a rounded corner, at least 1, maybe 2 rounded corners. And the second reason is that this is actually an insulating material. So what's happening here is the glass tab that's here and the glass tab that's down in here is insulated from all the intense heat from the kiln by the kiln bricks here and here. I mean, yes, heat can flow in this direction here in the hollow space in the stainless steel fold, but because there's so much insulating material on either side, the glass tabs are pretty much unaffected by the firing process, which is basically just being used to fuse the top piece on. And here's a look at that process. You can see this shiny area here and then this dull area down here. So the shiny area was glass that was pretty much unaffected by the firing process, and the dull area is a result of the glass remelting and having contact with the shelf primer. There we go. Actual 3-dimensional kiln work. Look at that. Beautiful stuff coming out of a fusing kiln. Alright, well, thanks for watching. And as I usually say, if you like what you see or learn something new, then please help to spread the word about these tutorials. And stay tuned, there's still lots more coming up. So until next time, have fun trying some 3-dimensional mold making and 3-dimensional fusing.